So this is the first of our series of CPD webinars for land agents, and this work is part of Scottish Land Commission's commitment to building good relationships with the sector and sharing the work of the Commission, and clarifying the role of the Commission and its advice, but also listening to the frontline experiences and the practical realities of land ownership and management's decision making that the sector can bring, which is so valuable. So these sessions have been developed in partnership with sector representatives. We've got an advisory panel of land agents and sector representatives who have fed into this. And it forms part of a series of webinars and face-to-face sessions that are going to be happening all year. We've got several webinars lined up for the first half of this year, and I'm going to post links in the chat later on in the session about those upcoming events for anyone who wants to keep in touch and hear about future events that might be of interest in your work. But coming to what we're talking about today, which is our session on land reform policy and land market insights, I'm delighted to welcome our policy lead, James MacKessack-Leitch, who's going to be talking to you in a minute, followed by our researcher and data analyst, Hanna Wheatley, both who work at the Commission. They're going to each do a presentation on the advice and research that the Commission has developed on these areas. And while they're presenting, you're welcome to put questions into the chat box. I won't be able to take any questions until they've both finished their presentations, and just because of the number of people in the room, we've got 46 at the moment, it would help me to facilitate the apologies. It would help me to facilitate the question and answer session if you type your questions into the chat, and I will bring those questions up. If there's enough space in the Q&A, I will take questions based on hands raised, but I think that might get a bit chaotic if I rely on that. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask James to share his presentation, and I'll hand you over now.
Good. Thank you, Karen. So good afternoon, everyone. As Karen set out, Hannah and I will be taking you through some of the policy work that the Commission has been embarked on, certainly over the last year, but a lot of it stems back a lot longer than that. I will go through a bit on the land reform bill, but mostly our advice on part one of the bill that was published in January. And then Hannah will come on to talk about our work on the land market, so both in terms of the data side, but also the insights that we collect from agents on an annual basis. As I say, I will be talking about our advice on part one of the bill. So hopefully everyone is aware that the land reform bill was introduced to Parliament just over a year ago. Three key areas for us to focus on today, and that has been the focus of our work over the past year or so, in terms of the draft provisions. So there's the land management plans. Essentially, these are a transparency mechanism with a duty around community engagement, not intended to be an operational plan that people will follow. So perhaps a query about the helpfulness of the name there, but nevertheless, very much drawing on the background and Commission's recommendations from previous years. Prior notification, again, is a transparency mechanism intended to ensure that communities, but also others who are trying to acquire land have the opportunity to do so. So quite often, I think Hannah will touch on this a bit later on, off-market and private sales are quite prevalent, as I'm sure you're aware. But that means that quite often farmers, communities, local businesses miss out on opportunities to acquire land, or even just to have a discussion with the selling landowner as to whether they might be able to acquire some land for their own needs and ambitions. So essentially that's circulating around the idea to provide opportunities and improving market participation. And then finally, very briefly, there's the transfer test, which will come into effect for land holdings that are over 1,000 hectares that are coming onto the market. Essentially, what the test will do is consider the impact of that land holding on the local community, looking at issues of community sustainability, and where issues may be arising, then, if appropriate, land could be lotted to improve community sustainability outcomes. But hopefully, as I say, this has been around for a year now, so everyone is reasonably familiar with what the bill itself says. In terms of our recommendations from January, some broad ones first on scope and thresholds. So firstly, we're recommending that thresholds are harmonised at 1,000 hectares or 25% of inhabited island. And this is across management plans, prior notification and the transfer test. So the bill at the moment has two different thresholds, a 3,000 hectare one for land holdings that would be required to produce management plans, and then 1,000 hectares, which would affect land holdings for prior notification and transfer tests. So as part of our advice in simplifying and kind of strengthening the bill, actually having everything sitting at 1,000 hectares provides more clarity and certainty. So there's less likely to be questions, and it also helps the interaction of the different mechanisms as well, which I'll touch on a bit later too. Perhaps one of the more quick fixes that we're suggesting, particularly in terms of determining the size of a holding, is to disregard public infrastructure. So particularly where that's created a title that severs a land holding into smaller pieces. So quite commonly that will be for railways, but also roads and perhaps in other circumstances as well, where a land holding may at one point have been one single large area and this has been split up. So it's a bit of a technical fix there. And then also, I think just a steer on proportionate consideration of how and when holdings are linked through other types of mechanisms. So we know that land is held in various different structures in Scotland, quite often through corporate and trust structures, and how they relate to each other, who the controlling parties are, is not often or is not always clear. But also, actually, a number of these cases are they're often few in number. So there's a query around how do we make sure that where holdings really are being controlled and managed as a single entity, that even where the corporate or trust structure or the ownership structure is complex, that they're treated that way, but also where they're not, that they're not. So we're not bringing things into scope that shouldn't be, but we're not excluding things that aren't. And also this clarity will help facilitate the monitoring as to the effectiveness of the mechanisms, but also perhaps be able to track where perhaps loopholes or potential avoidance routes are emerging. But turning first to land management plans in terms of the specific mechanisms. So one of the things we're recommending is a duty to demonstrate how the community engagement duty has informed the plan. This is very much about ensuring that engagement is not just a tick box exercise. So although the bill at the moment says there is a duty, there's no clarity as to what the impact of that duty is, how it needs to be done, and what the impact or effect is. So it's just a level of clarification there to hopefully make sure that element of the bill is strengthened. Similarly, a useful reference point where they exist is to draw on local place plans. So local place plans, as you may be aware, are obviously from a different area of statutes in terms of planning, but actually the process that the community goes through in terms of engagement, in terms of developing its priorities, outlining needs and ambitions, act as a really useful source of information about those things, and therefore it makes sense for the landowner to be drawing on that as they develop their plan. Where it comes to the issue of landowners not fulfilling their duties, there is a list of persons able to allege a breach within the bill at the moment. We're suggesting that be expanded to include some other bodies that we think have useful insight into land management issues and community relationships. So particularly community councils, enterprise agencies, national park authorities, and where relevant, the Crofting Commission, often have a different perspective and different personnel on the ground that interact with communities, and therefore would be in a good position to understand what's happening and whether there is a potential breach taking place of those duties. And then finally, for this first part of it, enabling the Land and Communities Commissioner to initiate a breach investigation. So the bill at the moment relies on a third party alleging a breach before an investigation could take place. It seems likely and that the Land Commission itself or the Land and Communities Commissioner may come across cases where actually waiting for a third party to allege a breach would be unhelpful, and actually there's sense in just directly intervening with an investigation at that point. So beyond the kind of specific changes to the legislation, I think there's some other things that can do in terms of helping support the role of land management plans. So the role of guidance will be clear. Obviously, every land holding in Scotland is unique, and therefore, while there needs to be clarity on the face of the bill, there also needs to be flexibility and guidance to recognise the difference between holdings in the south of Scotland, the borders, versus the Highlands, versus Aberdeenshire, versus island situations. So guidance will be a key element in how land management plans are formed, the details that landowners will be expected to include. And we feel that the Commission is in a good place to lead that, given our long-standing good practice programme and the successes that's had over the years in building relationships between landowners and communities in particular. We're also looking at the ability to apply cross-compliance penalties. So as it stands, the bill levies, there is the ability to levy a fine of up to £5,000 for non-compliance. However, it may well be that in some circumstances, other penalties may be more effective or more of a disincentive to avoid the provisions of the bill. That may include things like restrictions of public funding, so whether that's kind of agricultural subsidies or forestry grants or whatever it might be, as well as restriction on regulatory consent, so planning permissions, other types of consents that might be required. We're also looking at or we're also recommending the creation of a central online portal for plans. So again, this is to support accessibility, transparency and monitoring. If all land management plans are in a central place, then it's useful not just for the Commission and for government to be able to see that and to carry out the monitoring and evaluation, but also for the public at large to be able to scrutinise what landowners' visions, ambitions are, as well as keep a track of what's happening in their local area. And then the final point just on management plans for the moment is what we're recommending as alignment of the plan to provide that baseline information necessary for the transfer test. So coming into the transfer test, there's obviously, if we're assessing issues of community sustainability, it's helpful to know what the issues on the ground might be, how much housing stock that particular estate portfolio holds in the local area, how many jobs it provides, how many local businesses are dependent on it. Therefore, having that in clarity in the land management plan would be helpful for informing the transfer test. Moving on to prior notification of sale, our changes here are around a simplification to a single 90-day prohibition for qualifying sales, which would replace the 30 plus 40, which is in the bill at the moment. Hopefully that kind of reduces the amount of work that's required for communities, for government, and potentially for landowners, as well as if they intend to appeal the prohibitions. And doesn't really impinge on sales deadlines or that sort of thing, particularly for larger land sales. They can often take 90 days or indeed longer. We're also looking to introduce de minimis exceptions. So this would cover certain types of transfers, as well as looking at what a minimum threshold would be. So we know that for land holdings over 1,000 hectares, they are regularly or certainly often selling smaller plots of land, whether that's garden ground, boundary adjustments, perhaps housing plots, those sorts of things, which there isn't really any particular public or community interest in scrutinising and holding up. So therefore looking at a kind of minimum threshold for that. Also in terms of certain categories of transfer, so things like kind of selling to a sitting agricultural tenant, again, under some of that legislation, that there isn't really the opportunity for a third party to intervene, even if they wanted to. So just making sure that there's clarity there in terms of exemptions. As a counter to having minimum thresholds and exemptions, we're also looking to be able to introduce or recommending the introduction of the ability to designate assets of community significance. So where there is perhaps a very small site in, say, a village or the fringe of a town that actually has real community significance but would otherwise be considered de minimis, that could be designated through the land management plan. And that ensures that both the landowner and the community know that. If it's registered on the central portal, then the Commission and in public in general will know that those assets are of importance to that community. And therefore, if the landowner ever is considering a disposal, that they can take the appropriate steps to engage in the prior notification process. And then finally, looking at replacing a central register with a process of local notification. So the bill at the moment has developed a process or a central register where people who are interested in land in their area coming to market would register with government, and ministers would then notify those people if and when land that they were interested in came up for sale. We're suggesting actually a more local, decentralized version where actually local notification through local media, newspapers and the like, kind of in a parallel with kind of development planning at the moment. So the same way that planning notices go to the community council and are advertised in local papers, perhaps land sales should be as well. So again, just a bit of a simplification there all round. But moving on to the transfer test, we think, first of all, it would be helpful to make explicit reference to the public interest in the framing of the test. So at the moment, the framing is very much around community sustainability. The public interest is implicit within that, but I think, and then certainly the Commission feels that making that kind of upfront declaration of public interest in the framing helps the understanding and increases the legal clarity around the ambitions of the mechanism and makes it kind of more effective and more defensible should that be required. We're also suggesting that ministers have the power to review lotting decisions. So where a lotting decision is made, it may well be that a couple of years later, for whatever reason, circumstances change on the ground, a new community body is formed where there wasn't one at the time of the original decision, that ministers have the ability to review that decision and adjust lots if that's appropriate. And that would be on the same terms as the landowner. So there would have to be at least a year between a decision and a review. So there's no, so there's clarity on kind of what happens there in terms of a timeline. And then just a couple of things that are perhaps a bit more detail on how the process would work. So there is a role for the Land and Communities Commissioner, so the new post that would be created within the Commission to lead the investigation into issues around community sustainability before making recommendations to ministers. We're suggesting that is a two-phase process. So initially there would be a rapid scoping phase, which would be able to draw on hopefully the information that's in the land management plan that the landowner has produced, but also look at some wider factors and actually rule out sales or proposed sales at that point within a very short time frame. Only if there were issues identified would the assessment move into a more detailed phase where recommendations for intervention could be made. So again, trying to simplify the process there, and we would expect that perhaps the majority of significant land transfers that come to the market would be ruled out in a rapid scoping phase and would be able to proceed as is. But where necessary, that detailed investigation can be done for holdings where there perhaps is interest from the community or issues on the ground, and where lotting may ultimately be appropriate. Linked to that, we're also recommending a role for public land acquisition in the transfer test as a potential outcome. So again, this is not just about kind of adding to the public estate for the sake of it, but very much about public sector leadership in particularly two areas. So first of all, holding land on a temporary basis to allow communities to organise and fundraise, because we know that can take time. Compelling a landowner to wait that period of time is possibly not entirely fair. So ensuring that there is a kind of interim phase of public land ownership perhaps gives comfort to the landowner that they can sell the land and move on, while the community still has the time and scope to be able to organise and fundraise as they need. Linked to that, it's also an option for significantly speeding up sales and providing certainty where land has been lotted, if public land acquisition has been considered as part of that mix, and the lotting decision reflects where government or where the public sector may be interested in taking on ownership. It means that once that decision is made, once that lotting decision is made, the public sector can come in with an offer on day one, and obviously the landowner is not compelled to accept it, but they could do and move on at that stage. So just the final thing on some of our advice. So there are very much data gaps that we are currently looking to fill. So particularly around de minimis thresholds for prior notification, we have very limited data. Difficult to know what the scale threshold would be, what an appropriate scale threshold would be. Some of the evidence that we've seen for things like garden ground boundary adjustments, driveways, that sort of thing are very small. We're looking at tens, perhaps a couple of hundred square meters, and therefore something like 0.05 hectares may be appropriate. But what we really need is better evidence. And I think this is where my ask to you as land agents is that, you know, in order for our proposals to be successful, we need to have clear evidence to base those thresholds on. If we don't get that, we'll make a best guess, and so be it. We'll all have to live with that. So this really is an opportunity for agents, for professionals, for those with the knowledge to come forward and say to us, actually, here is a sensible threshold. Here is the evidence that backs it up, and we can work through that and then propose an appropriate threshold to government at that point. Similarly, questions around ownership structures, so particularly corporate and trust structures, and whether there are options for avoidance routes or loopholes and any subsequent action in there. Again, some of this is quite difficult to track through different registers that are sometimes within kind of the devolved system, but also obviously, you know, kind of corporate legislation is reserved. So there are different bits and pieces and challenges trying to track ownership structures, and therefore whether a landholding ultimately would be in scope or not. And then any other potential unintended consequences that may be arising either out of the bill as written or anything that we ourselves are proposing. So again, now is the time to speak up, to speak to the Commission in confidence if needs be, and we can take those issues forward. But essentially, I'll finish there and say, now or never, this is the opportunity to influence the land reform bill, and I would urge you to take that opportunity while the time is there. Thank you.
Great. I think I'm going to be taking over from James now. So thanks, James. I'm Hanna Wheatley, for those who don't know me, and I'm responsible for research at the Commission. I'll try to be brief, as I know you'll all have lots of questions on what you've heard. But essentially, I'm going to talk about our land market research. So James, can you move us on to the first slide? We've been doing land market research at the Commission for around 4 years. And our aim with that is to provide information about what's happening in the rural land market, primarily to help inform policy and our advice to government. But also I know lots of other people are finding it very useful as well, including some of you, I'm sure. We've got a partnership with Scotland's Rural College, SRUC, to deliver this work. And at the moment, we're producing 2 reports each year, a data report and an insights report. The insights report is based on interviews with land agents, usually between 15 and 20 each year. And some of you, in fact, may have been interviewed for these. They're extremely important to give us an understanding of what's happening on the ground in terms of sort of motivations behind sales, for sellers, for buyers, different actors in the market, across different land uses. The data report, on the other hand, is our own internal analysis of Registers of Scotland data for land market activity, and we use their non-residential land values data, looking specifically at rural areas over 25 hectares in forestry farming estates, and various other sort of caveats and and things that we put on those, which you can find in the report. Next slide, please, James. So I'm going to talk a bit about the land market report, data report from last year, which looked at the calendar year 2023. So in terms of the number and scale of transactions, there were fewer transactions covering a smaller area of land in 2023, reflecting a slowdown in the market compared to previous years. And that really echoes findings from the Rural Land Market Insights report from last year too, which was based on interviews with land agents over the same period, which described restricted supply and weakened demand in 2023. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with that. A couple of the other key headlines were around forestry in retreat. So the number, area, value of forestry land sold declined in 2023. And our analysis found that the total area reduced by quite a bit, by 54% compared to 2022. Some of the emerging trends that have been very helpful with sort of our advice on the Land Reform Bill, there are actually very few large-scale transactions each year. We've found only 26 from between 2020 and 2023 that were over 1,000 hectares, and that's between 4 and 11 each year. The vast majority of sales are less than 500 hectares. Next slide, please, James. We compare our findings to industry reports from some of your organisations, and we do that to kind of test the robustness of our findings. And they don't always match up directly. We look at the calendar year, some industry reports look September to September, and you'll see in this example where I'm comparing our data on the number of farms sold with Stratton Parker numbers for the number of farms marketed, because they didn't publish on farms sold in that year. But the blue and pink lines are for the area of farms sold or marketed, and that's on the right-hand axis. And you'll see that they show a broadly similar pattern. So even though our numbers aren't exactly the same, we're seeing a similar pattern, which helps us to feel confident about the research that we're doing. The next slide shows a heat map of the distribution of all sales between 2020 and 2023. And so you can see some of the broad hotspots emerging, but we generally tend to break down our findings into the different land uses. So the next slide will talk about average per hectare farmland values by the size of the land sale, again, across the 4-year period. And what you'll see there with the pink dot in the middle of those bars is the average price per hectare is increasing each year for farmland. And yet that's despite variation within types of farmland. So we know from industry reports and also our insights report that upland marginal land for planting experienced a bubble in 2021 and 22, and that's coming down from, but the stable value of prime arable land and the continued presence of rollover funds kept farmland values overall steady. So we're still seeing that kind of increase despite variation within that, and of course regional variation, which is a huge factor. So speaking of regional variation, the next slide shows average farmland market value and average per hectare value by region. So on the left-hand axis, that's particularly large kind of market shares evident in Aberdeenshire, Angus, Ayrshire, Perthshire and Kirkcudbright, all of which have productive farming sectors, so that's no surprise. But the purple dots, which are the right-hand axis, that's average per hectare values. And so those at a county level obviously also show quite a lot of variation, with particularly high values here in Angus, reflecting better quality arable land. The next slide shows a comparison between farmland and forestry sales over the 4-year period in terms of the heat maps. And the heat maps are just kind of a tool to show the number of sales in particular areas. So you can see a kind of farming locus in the northeast. And we know, in comparison, that the bulk of 2020 to 2023 forestry market value and also number of sales is concentrated in 4 counties, really: Dumfriesshire, Roxburghshire, and Argyll and Perthshire. So the next slide, I'm going to switch to talking a bit more about forestry sales, and this one is a little bit more kind of stark, the change over the years. The number of forests and woodlands sold in 2023 was 37, which was a 31% reduction from 2022. and the area sold was a 54% reduction from 2022. And that mirrors findings from, for example, the UK Forest Market Report, which described the number of sales in 2023 as well below the historical range, and our own Insights report, which also found that forestry was considerably slower in 2023 than in previous years. Moving on to forestry values, in Hill Hill's report, they described the commercial forestry market as having peaked in 2022 after 19 years. And we've certainly seen in our reports that the kind of growing influence of forestry that we've discussed in previous iterations of this report and the Insights report, including a kind of rapid growth in forestry prices, particularly in the southwest of Scotland, appears to have peaked in 2021 and 22. And so these reports have sort of demonstrated that much of the heat has since subsided from that market, with the number, area and value of sales all reducing from those highs. Moving on to talk about estates briefly. Estate sales remain relatively consistent, with between sort of 22 and 25 estates sold each year in the 4 years that we looked at. Over the 4 years, only 20 estates sold were over 1,000 hectares, of which half were over 3,000 hectares, whereas the majority of estates that we were looking at were relatively small, with 60 of the 95 estates sold in total under 500 hectares. Now, with estates, I just need to give a bit of a caveat that estate isn't a land classification that's recognised by Registers of Scotland. So it's something that we're looking for in the data, whereas farmland and forestry is sometimes quite a lot easier to spot. So it does make identifying estates in the ROS data particularly difficult. So I think there's probably slightly more kind of room for a slightly larger margin of error with our analysis of estates, and that's something that we're working on improving each year. So for example, over the last 18 months, we've been collecting sort of real-time data on land that's being marketed from lots of different agencies, so that we've also got sort of a bank of sales particulars that we can cross-reference against when it comes to analysing Registers data. I'll just talk briefly about the Insights findings before finishing and handing back over to Karen. This slide looks at the Land Market Insights sort of findings from last year's report, which again looks at 2023, and some of the kind of big trends that were emerging and that we were seeing that are interesting and that influence some of our work. So we're seeing the influence of global kind of macroeconomic factors, so seeing investors buying land as an inflation hedge, for example, which sort of shows, how open and vulnerable the land market is in lots of ways to external forces. We're also seeing a sort of what we're calling a bit of a natural capital reality check, following lots of speculative purchases in 2021 and 2. The mood music in 2023 was that there's a kind of growing uncertainty about the carbon market. I'm sure this won't be news to any of you, and that the government is sort of perceived to have stepped back slightly from initial kind of enthusiasm. I think although I think we're now seeing the initial reports that we put out in 2022, looking at the 2021 market, seeing that as really capturing a moment in time where the dynamics of the emerging natural capital market were a big driver of price and demand in the land sector. Whereas now we're sort of seeing that there's kind of increased caution entering the market, and that's having an effect. The final point I'll talk about here is just around public policy, a sort of sense from agents and from some of our findings in those reports that some of the net zero targets and land reform objectives sometimes appear to be kind of pulling in tension with each other, and that's playing out in the land market. So I think those findings sort of point to lots of different things. Also, there's a point about fiscal policy there, and influences that a single tax can have on the land market, and there's lots that we take away from those emerging trends. But as I say, they are just emerging. We've only got 4 years of data, so we're really keen to continue monitoring the land markets to keep providing that sort of vital evidence base on which we can inform policy recommendations. So that's been a very whistle-stop tour of our land market research. I hope there's been some points of interest in there for some of you. Scarlett, I think, has put the reports in the chat, and you can always be in touch with me if you've got questions or thoughts. Keep an eye out also for our reports this year. We're going to be launching our next Insights report at this year's Royal Highland Show. And we've already got the initial kind of findings from that, which, is based on interviews with land agents in 2024. So stay tuned for those.